somebody starts down a path thinking they know what that looks like, here's the expectations over here. We have a check-in point and we're not anywhere aligned. And that causes frustration on both sides.
All right, welcome back to Leading Without the BS, unfiltered, unapologetic, and focused on unstoppable performance. I'm your host, Mike Johnson, and today we're tackling a big one. When are the costs of poor performance coming from you? Joining us today is someone that knows this very well, Dianne Grote Adams, the president and owner of CFX Inc. Let's jump right in. Well, Dianne, super excited to have you this morning. It's been a while since we've seen each other, and it's really awesome to be talking again. Our listeners are in for a real treat. So,
it's good to see you again. It's fun to be in another area of our world, right?
Yeah. Kick us off with a quick introduction. Share your role, the work that you do, and some of the leaders that you support.
Okay. So I am a health and safety professional. I hate to admit, been doing that more than 40 years, but am the president owner of CFX, a consulting firm that does health and safety, and I've been doing that for more than 30 years. So we work with companies that are on various stages of their safety journey, as I like to call it, either need temporary help or maybe need a boost, or even maybe just need an outline on where do I get started. So that's our group of customers that we work with.
Outstanding. And so, yeah, you've spent a long time in the safety industry, and it's awesome, the work that you do and the support that you and your team provide. I'm certain that you've seen that clarity really is important in those high stakes situations, especially when we're talking about safety. So how do you unspoken expectations show up in your world?
No, that's a really good question. And I think both in the world of safety as well as in our organization, there's all kinds of ideas that come to mind when I say what happens when we have unspoken expectations or we don't communicate clearly. One of the things that sticks to my mind that helps me try to refocus on clear communication on a regular basis is that from a professional liability standpoint, our insurance company told us years and years ago that the number one reason that consultants ever get sued is because of poor communication, lack of clarity on what the customer was expecting and what the consultant was going to deliver. So I keep being reminded every day, oh, that's really important. We need to take the time to communicate. But for anyone who's ever been in fast-paced organizations, sometimes we fail, right? And we aren't as clear in our communication. So I see in the safety world, you might have a safety leader in an organization that believes they understand what the organization wants to achieve. And so they put all their energy and efforts going in that direction, and oftentimes are not really aligned with the management team. And the management team doesn't understand the resources necessary maybe to achieve the dream or the vision of the safety leader. So in the big picture, working with companies, I see a lot of disconnect in that area. And I'm sure you might have seen that in some of your experiences as well before this.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only in safety, in many ways that we support people within different types of business, both as a leader in manufacturing and then also supporting leaders here at Wingspan. It's not uncommon to have either unspoken expectations or unclear expectations, especially when it comes to behaviors.
Well, and I think, my experience is, depending on who your leader is, particularly in the safety world, we get a lot of technical training, whether that's in school or after school. We're always learning subject matter that's specific to technical. And very rarely do we get reinforcements that communication and aligning yourself with those people that you're working with is important. And I think that's where the disconnect often happens from my perspective. It's not that we don't care. But nobody ever explained to us that you really need to have a good conversation with your leaders about what does safety look like, or any other area. I assume it's just my world's limited to the safety world, right?
Yeah, you have a unique relationship with a lot of your clients where you're stepping in, you are bringing a lot of that technical expertise, and that's what they're counting on you for. How do you navigate that conversation when you're seeing that gap because expectations are unclear?
It's a good question. I have found that, I don't know if it's maturity and or the fact that I don't work in an organization, it has gotten easier for me over time to be able to more clearly say that I'm not sure we're on the same page, or I'm not sure this has been clearly communicated. So basically, calling out that we have a gap or a misunderstanding or a lack of clarity, in a nice way, of course. But I think sometimes if you are on the outside looking in, it's better received than, or easier received than if it's a peer to peer relationship. So I guess it gives me a slight advantage, I think, when I notice it in a client situation. But then I have to do it here in our organization too. And I don't know that it's always as well received as maybe the client receives it, because again, we're in the same organization. If that makes, it shouldn't make sense, but it does happen, at least in my world.
It does. And it's not different from the conversations that I have with a lot of leaders that I support here with Wingspan. We are not in it every day. And at times you're seeing from a different perspective what might be happening and can interject with some additional clarity and perhaps a unique perspective. So it's not surprising, and understand that it is helpful when you are interjecting and providing some additional insight. They're counting on you for it, just as they are counting on me for it. What is interesting that I have found, one of the things that I have found is very interesting, is as I'm navigating these types of conversations with leaders to define what's required for the roles in their organization, or working through the frustration that they're having, they will start to articulate very clearly to me what they're expecting from others. And it's as simple as saying, "You got it. Say that out loud. Tell your team what you're telling me."
Yeah, I see the same thing. But for whatever reason, they don't either take that time to clearly articulate it, or perhaps they soften the language when they go to have a conversation. And I don't know if that's, they don't want to hurt someone's feelings, or they don't want to step on toes, whatever emotional impact seems to be changing that language. But I see that a lot in the safety perspective, or even expectations about what a person can accomplish, and yet they haven't necessarily given them the resources to be able to accomplish that. And so not opening the door of conversation between the leader and the safety leader sometimes is a challenge, because they aren't on the same page from what is it that you really want me to accomplish. I thought you wanted this, and now the leader's saying yes, but you didn't do this. But then they don't have a clear path that they're going to move forward on.
Absolutely. What you said resonates so well. When you've seen that with leaders, that someone says, "This is what I thought we were doing," and the leader says, "This is what I was expecting." What are some of the contributing factors that you have seen that's led to that disconnect?
I think it's a lack of clarity around goals and vision right off the bat. Because many times a safety leader is brought into an organization, and if they're replacing someone else, they are asked to look at all the information that the other person was doing and keep it going. Or they might have said the person that left wasn't doing X well, so we need to make sure you address that. But I don't very often see an initial meeting where the organizational leader puts out their vision, their expectation with measurable goals. I think they say we want to be safe. We want our people to go home safe at the end of the day. All right, well, what does that look like? There's a lot of steps for that to occur. And you and I might have a completely different vision of what that go home safe at the end of the day looks like. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, to me, where I see the miss is just that initial, let's be really clear. What are the tasks? What are the goals? What are we trying to achieve? Not this vision. Hey, everybody's going to go home safe at the end of the day. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so common to see that type of disconnect right off the start. One other thing that shows up quite often is leaders communicating that these are my expectations rather than these are the expectations of the role, these are the expectations of the organization, and taking that out, that this isn't Mike's opinion or something that excuse me, something that Mike is specifically asking you for. These are requirements of the job, and this is what success looks like. That clarity is very supportive. And you touched on early in the conversation how there's many technical aspects in the world of safety. Also, what we don't see in many situations is those behavioral expectations. How are you expecting that individual to show up when they're communicating with their teams? What does that look like? How are they escalating concerns? How are they supporting others through feedback and accountability?
I agree. And in many cases, I believe our development of safety leaders has done them a disadvantage in that we don't focus on how do you effectively communicate with your management team, or how do you effectively communicate with the people on the floor. Is it about coaching, or is it about correcting behavior? And how you deliver that message, as you and I both know, varies considerably on how that person is going to respond. And my early years when I first started in manufacturing, absolutely could I have done a better job in communicating to individuals on the floor than I would do now. But I didn't know any different, and I knew that I was there to make sure that the safety policies were being enforced, but without wanting to be a cop, because that wasn't my personality. But sometimes, you're almost forced to call someone out for a behavior. And if you don't have any skill set on how to do that, that's a difficult conversation to have.
Absolutely. And most of us have been through a similar journey. There are many times throughout my career in manufacturing that I was told I was a great communicator. And that was something that I wore as a badge of honor. And what I have found as I've worked with Wingspan and now stepping in to support other leaders, so much of my language that I was using in those situations was not supporting the conversation. So you mentioned that at times leaders are not providing clarity, and it depends on how the other person might receive that message. Our approach is a little different, that I'm only responsible for myself. The language that I use, the questions that I ask, more clear and concise, more powerful, advancing questions, those are more likely to influence other individuals, though I don't have any other control over them. It's provided a lot of clarity for me that the language that I choose and how I'm externally communicating that message is the most important way. And when I'm very intentional about that, it's more likely that I'm going to influence other people.
I agree with that. And I think what I have found, I'm a very blunt, bulleted communicator naturally, which in my mind provides great clarity. However, while I'm not responsible for the emotional response of someone, if I know that they are an extremely sensitive individual and may immediately react to my tone because I am kind of like, here we are, let's go. I know I need to soften that a little bit and say, all right, we're going to go on a journey together. Mm-hmm. And here's my points. So I don't think I ever got feedback anywhere along my career until I started digging into communication styles that, oh, maybe you shouldn't be so blunt, or maybe you shouldn't be so bulleted, that people might not welcome your thoughts because of the way you deliver, not necessarily the content of what you're delivering. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, most definitely. You mentioned earlier in the call that navigating that type of conversation is also quite different when you're working with another organization as a consultant versus your own internal team. How do you navigate that type of conversation in those two situations?
I find the communication with clients to be much easier for my natural communication style, because many times they're on a tight schedule, and they want to know what it is I need to do. Let's go, let's get out of here. And that's why they hire us. But that's also because they are, I believe, perceived like every minute she's here, we're paying for her. So we got to get her out of here. And I don't know that they're really thinking that, but there's always that in the back of the mind that this is costing money. So I think they are more open to more bulleted direct feedback than the people I work with on a day-to-day basis. They want to develop long-term relationships with me. They want my input. I think there's a little bit of, I want her approval going on, so I think all those secondary issues besides just what are we trying to accomplish make that a more difficult conversation and more challenging to communicate effectively. There seems to be a lot more, for lack of a better word, baggage that goes with internal conversations than with clients.
And how do you see that show up with clients?
With clients, it's just a matter of easy conversation about what it is that we need to accomplish and what are the steps to get there. And can we help you get there? And what resources are they going to have? And if they start to hesitate, then I think it's a follow-up question of what of those things we just discussed are making you uncomfortable? Or are you not on the same page with me? Or maybe you don't have the resources yet and we have to do that later, or we have to slow down the pace. So with clients, I find it, again, to be a much easier conversation than internal people. My internal staff, we have to be more clear about actually mentoring them to learn to talk to clients, because clients will often call in. They're not all talking to me, obviously, and some of our younger staff get a little shook when a client seems demanding. But again, it may be a communication style and not necessarily they're upset. But you have to learn to help them navigate that. Is the client really upset, or is it just they are communicating their expectations and you're interpreting, because they're being clear and direct, that there's some emotion behind that? So we've coached a lot of times about that internally.
Yeah, those are some high stakes situations where you're preparing your team to go out into a very high stakes environment in the world of safety, especially as you're walking into manufacturing facilities and you're also supporting them on the environmental side. How are you preparing your team around their behavioral expectations and how they're showing up in those types of conversations?
We could do more, in all honesty. But if I know the customer and our employees are getting ready to go out to talk to a client, if there's anything I know about the client that I think is going to help ease that conversation, it's a preparatory conversation, right? I'm going to say, hey, this person likes to chit chat about X, Y, and Z, and they may derail your time there. So you're going to have to be prepared to bring it back to what you're trying to accomplish. Don't let them talk, not saying that's not a good thing, but you don't want to let them use up all the time and then you don't get your questions answered. So don't hesitate to just redirect the conversation and say, I really love to hear more about your dog, but I need to get this information and then we can talk more about it. Or, it might be the other way around. client is a very direct communicator, and I just prep the individuals that this person is very direct, and they're going to come across what you might interpret to be harsh. Don't interpret that as criticism. That's just the way they communicate. So don't put an emotional response into what you hear. But unfortunately, we talk about that for specific customers, and in general, when we know someone has had what they feel is a difficult interaction, and just try to prep everyone that, you don't respond emotionally. Many times the emotional response is not the correct response.
Yeah, we definitely at Wingspan we talk about. There's an exercise and a tool that we support our leaders with, and it's called the 2-word check-in. And part of that is taking a moment to understand where you're at physically, mentally, and emotionally, and doing an assessment and picking 2 very precise words to describe that. And there's so much power in naming what those emotions are, so that you can then speak for those emotions rather than from them. And it helps support you in those situations and how you're showing up.
I think that's a great toolkit, not just for leaders, but for anyone in the communication or interacting, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned that how you're crafting that message is important depending on who you're working with. Absolutely. The words that you use, we jokingly have some words that we call illegal words that don't add additional clarity to the conversation. So words as I think or we need versus more descriptive language that we are going to take this action by this date is much more supportive in those situations. One of the most common contributions that leaders have to those situations where their teams are underperforming is being unclear with expectations, whether that's unspoken or just not using language that provides that clarity. At times, we add additional words to support us, and it's not necessarily adding value to the conversation.
Oh, I think it's a whole additional layer of difficulty when it's an underperformance as opposed to just performance. Many of our customers and employees just need to accomplish certain things, as opposed to we are now addressing a poor performance and then we need to raise it up to accomplish things. When you're talking about poor performance, I do believe, yes, that is more difficult because many of us don't want to hurt feelings, so to speak, and become, I think, less direct than if you were just laying out a project. At least that's been my observation when I watch conversations around me.
When you're starting off a new relationship, perhaps you're working with a new customer, what are some of the specific behavioral or technical expectations that you work to communicate upfront?
That's a broad question. Thanks for that one. And I'll side note and then I'll answer your question. One of the things that I think is sometimes difficult for leaders in unspoken expectations is the fact that you have done something so many times that you don't realize you're doing it. And I know there's a proper term for that. And so you don't remember that this is something that needs to be communicated. So when I call a customer, I'm listening to their tone of voice, the way they describe something, whether they use a lot of adjectives or they're very bulleted. And I tend to make note of that and mimic to a degree that style. I'm not going to use a bunch of flowery language with a lot of explanations to a bulleted communicator, because I know that that's not the way they naturally communicate. Therefore, they probably don't want to hear my extras. There are customers that love to start the conversation with, hey, how was your weekend? How's the weather? Da, da, da. And then you mentally prepare, that's how we're going to have this conversation and then evolve. So I think a lot of it's just listening to the cues, at least from a communication and behavioral standpoint with a customer, I have some customers that walk rapidly, directly, and keep moving. And then there are others that kind of meander. So if you're walking with them, I kind of, adjust my pace to theirs and not march ahead of them. So I think it's really just being aware of how your customer behaves, and you want to make them more comfortable. The technical is just the years of experience in trying to figure out what is their vision and expectation, which is often they're not sure what their expectation is, other than they want their people to go home safe at the end of the day. So we have to start peeling that back.
Love it. And you mentioned something really important. We touched on it very early in the conversation, that is a normal occurrence or a likely thing to happen, is that leaders don't always speak their expectations out loud. We leave room for assumptions, or because of previous experience, we believe that others understand what we're thinking in our minds, and we don't always clearly articulate that to other people, so that there is that clarity of what's required of each of us for the team to be successful. When that expectations, you've been in this type of work for a long time, and you've supported a lot of different organizations. What patterns have you seen when it comes to unspoken expectations?
I see the unspoken expectations causing difficulties in moving forward, right? Because somebody starts down a path thinking they know what that looks like. Here's the expectations over here. We have a check-in point and we're not anywhere aligned. And that causes frustration on both sides. It may cause stronger emotion than frustration, depending on the situation and the time frames. Excuse me. And then it causes additional work, right? If we are not aligned, particularly if I'm a consultant, I have to meet the customer's expectations. So if I don't clearly know what that is and I've gone down the wrong path, well, I've got two choices, right? They're not going to work with me anymore, and we've wasted all of that effort and resources on both sides, or we got to fix this and make sure it's in alignment with them. And usually that's at our cost, right? So now we've got frustration on both ends. That doesn't help you develop trust with either party, and it makes you question everything that you're doing, which then results in additional work. And a lot of emotional fatigue on both sides as well.
Yeah.
Because somebody is answering to somebody on both sides of the journey there, and they're going back to say, well, I didn't get what I needed, or I didn't deliver what was needed. And neither one of those are a positive outcome in their minds.
Yeah, so many costs. You mentioned
Yes.
True cost, dollars. And also in your world, when I was in manufacturing and had the great opportunity to work with you and your team, it was clear at times that I was not setting clear expectations for what safety looked like in our organization. And partnering with you helped to clarify what that looked like. And even from the technical aspect, I had real risk and concern from a safety standpoint. When you're not clearly communicating what's required of team members in organizations to remain safe, not only do you have all of those other costs with frustration, wasted time, dollars spent, also there's the risk of potentially someone getting hurt because you haven't either spoken out loud what's required in those types of situations, or you're not modeling those behaviors, and you're allowing others to continually not meet those expectations. So it's a continuous cycle of being clear, communicating those behavioral and technical expectations, and then continuing to support with feedback and accountability in those situations.
I agree. And I think that addresses it, but I think it's clear that we need to be clear in communicating our expectations, that many times we are overcoming what can be described as bad habits. So behaviors that have been acceptable for a period of time could be long, could be short, but behaviors that aren't going to contribute to the best outcome, particularly in safety. They are at risk behaviors. And yet we have turned our head or didn't realize they were at serious at risk as they are. And therefore, no one ever has addressed them. And so, people roll their eyes in safety. Well, we've done it like this for 30 years. Why do we need to change now? But that is an expectation that we need to address. And that just because we have done it and pulled it off for 30 years or whatever that number is, doesn't mean it's the correct way to do it going forward. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes as we are trying to clearly address expectations, we need to address, yes, it's different than what you've been told in the past. And no, we didn't intentionally misdirect you, or no, that person wasn't intentionally giving you bad information. It might have been just lack of information on our part. And that's what I think we see, particularly in safety, a lot. And I assume it covers other areas of an organization as well, right?
Yeah, Dianne, you have done a tremendous job today of sharing what you've seen when expectations are unclear or perhaps unspoken, and conveying the true costs that can occur in those situations. As we're wrapping up, what's one sentence you want leaders to remember when the pressure is high and expectations are unspoken?
Someone told me once, as a leader, you're being watched and emulated 24/7. So anytime that I'm in a situation where stakes are high, I remember that sentence. I'm being watched and emulated. So how do I respond and react and communicate? And a lot of times that's like, take the high road, remember? Don't emotionally respond. Be very clear in your expectations and communications, and it will all work out. And make sure they know you got your back if they need something. So that's what keeps me maybe in check, so that I don't communicate in a bad way at certain times.
Outstanding. It's awesome to have you with us and speaking today. For everyone else listening, work to be crystal clear with your expectations, both behavioral and technical, and you'll continue to lead without the BS.